Hi, this is Ira Gorlick, and this is a sort of unique lecture on what is optimum. So as we know, we always talk about, or I always talk about, the learning objective, and remember the learning objective is to determine the optimum role of the community in managing commerce in general and telecommunications and the internet in specific. So obviously, if we're going to try to determine what the optimum role is, we need to determine what is optimum. So that becomes the key question. What is optimum? I'm going to show you a video now of Ted Cruz describing what he thinks is not optimal in terms of net neutrality.
What happens when government starts regulating a service as a public utility? It calcifies everything. It freezes it in place. Let's give a simple contrast. The Telecommunications Act of 1934 was adopted to regulate these, to put regulations in place, and what happened? It froze everything in place. This is regulated by Title II. This is not. Your smartphone, the internet, the apps, all of this is outside of Title II. The innovation is happening without having to go to government regulators and say, "Mother, may I?" We want a whole lot more of this and a whole lot less of this.
What Ted Cruz is saying is telecommunications regulations are bad. Telecommunications regulations calcify innovation. There's two broad perspectives of what is optimal. One is that optimum is fixed and universal. Optimum is judged against a fixed moral standard, often based on Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, and I'm going to go over that in a second. The other broad perspective is that optimum is dynamic and relative to the context. Here, optimum is judged against the greatest good to the greatest number of people, and is usually based on the works of utilitarianism and/or relativism. So let me give you examples of these two broad perspectives. First, the example of something that's fixed and universal we call Kantian, and that is telecommunication regulations are always bad. The market should always be free. The Bible describes absolute truths that never change, the Ten Commandments. So you can look for words like always, never, absolute. Those are key phrases when you look at the Kantian view that optimum is fixed and universal. The other side is the optimum is dynamic and relative to the context. Here you might say telecommunication regulations may sometimes be good. Sometimes the market should not be free. And there are very few, if any, absolute economic, political, social, or religious truths. There are a few, but they're very few, and one can even argue if there really is any. So, just quickly to go over what categorical imperative means, because it's important. Immanuel Kant believed that ethical people should be guided by what he called a categorical imperative. Behavior here under categorical imperative, behavior is universal and reversible. In terms of universal, is what is optimum is always the same. The end does not justify the means ever. And the rule applies universally to all locations and situations. And it's reversible. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And applies equally to the actor proposing the rule as the target of the rule. Kant believed that widespread adherence to the categorical imperative would dramatically reduce the need for administrative agencies. And you can see why Kant's views are popular with free marketers, because of the emphasis on individual rights. And as he said, if everybody did it, you could use limited government. And it's actually the origin of the notion of inalienable rights, that there are some rights that should not be accessible by the government. What is optimum is fixed and universal. Relativism, on the other hand, is the major alternative to Kant. In essence, it's saying policies that result in the greatest good for the greatest number of people are judged as optimal. Utilitarians could justify testing AIDS drugs even though they know that more of the control group will die if they do not receive treatment. Kantians say never use people as a means to an end. Relativism is the fundamental tool used by economists to do cost-benefit analysis. And that's critical, that if you do any cost-benefit analysis, you are using relativism. And under this, what is optimum is dynamic and context-specific. Utilitarianism is based on examining the consequences of any act, with the merits of an act being determined by the greatest good for the greatest number. Thus, determining whether or not one should tell a lie depends on the consequences. Or another example of dropping the atomic bomb in World War II. These two different views of optimum, Kantian optimum is determined by God and written in the Bible. It is always true. Utilitarian optimum is determined by man and relative to the context the action occurs. I found some simple, I did a simple internet search, and I found some people that believe relativism is one of the most significant problems today, and I have some quotes here that I thought was interesting. Relativism as a denial of absolute truth leads to moral license and the denial of the possibility of sin and of God. The denial of the absolute reference denies God, who equates to absolute truth. Without God, it is impossible to determine what is optimal. I have to tell you, my bias here is that I am firmly a relativist. I believe determining what is optimal is relative to the specific situation and context. And of course, not of course, but my example I always use is driving speeds. The speed I drive is relative to the situation and context. On a 50-mile-an-hour road, if it's icy out, I'm going to drive 10 miles an hour. If the weather's nice and it's a clear road and it's not very crowded, I may drive 60 miles an hour. That I'm going to adapt my behavior to the context and the situation. So the next lecture I'm going to talk about is rationality and commerce, and that's important for a free market to function well.